everybody, and welcome to the second public discussion held by the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. Last week, we discussed the role of technology in the light of Apple founder Steve Jobs' death. This week, we'd like to focus on the topic of food as an access for culture in light of World Food Day that actually took place yesterday all over the world. World Food Day is held by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and it's celebrated every year on the 16th of October. And that was actually the day that the organization was founded in 1945, just in case anyone didn't know. The objectives of World Food Day are to encourage attention to agricultural food production and to stimulate national, bilateral, multilateral, and non-governmental efforts to this end, to encourage economic and technical cooperation among developing countries, to encourage the participation of rural people, particularly women and the least privileged categories, in decisions and activities that actually influence their living conditions, the way that they live, to heighten public awareness of the problem of hunger in the world, and to promote the transfer of technologies, which is what we discussed last week, to the developing world, and strengthen national solidarity in the struggle against hunger, malnutrition, poverty, and draw attention to achievements in food and agricultural development. So our topic today is food as an access to culture, and it has been said by numerous figures, you are what you eat, and that the food that we like, the food that we buy, the food that we sell, says a great deal about the people that we are and the cultures that we're from. I'm sure everyone knows that pizza is from Italy and sushi is from Japan, and so food is arguably one of the most basic means of spreading cultural diplomacy and cultural awareness across the world, and offers us a doorway into cultures and countries that we might not necessarily access in any other way. So the question that we're putting to you today is, do you think that food is the best way for a country to present their culture? And do you think it's the best way to understand cultural diplomacy or culture? So just a bit of admin, as with last week, we hope for everyone's participation. Please do and try to keep responses to a maximum of 2 minutes. And remember, you can speak more than once. So, the 2-minute rule is only per speak. So I'm going to open the floor to you guys. What do you think? Do you think that food is the easiest way of accessing different cultures? Okay, Val.
Well, I do think food is one of the easiest ways. I mean, we have a lot of foreign restaurants around the world from pretty much every nation in the world, but I think it's a very superficial approach to cultural diplomacy and accessing culture. We actually need to go to the people and invite the people to us. And in that sense, food is a very, very strong promoter of cultural diplomacy, because people get together over food. People have to eat logically. People, when you cook more food, it is more efficient for the single process, and so many people eat at the same time, and you can, and also a lot of rituals in our life revolve around food, and they are also so the significance of the food, of the rituals, is best presented at home, so the people can see how people live. Actually, that is what promotes culture.
Thank you, Phil. Does anyone agree with Phil? Anyone disagree with Phil?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. A lot of our interactions daily do revolve around eating times, etc. One thing that we were thinking about when we were coming up for the theme for this week is our access to different cultures through food, is it too accessible? So, okay, we automatically synonymize sushi with Japan, but does the fact that we have sushi on our doorstep, we can make it at home, does that mean that we have less desire to go to Japan because we have the culture readily available, or does it actually create an increased interest in the country? So it's two sides of an argument there. Can I respond?
Through Ukrainian food, I also tell something about traditions of my country. So in this way, I promote my culture, and so the cultural evening and food itself, it is how the food and culture cooperate together and build a dialogue between people. So, if anyone agrees, I'll just.
I was wondering if I could complicate this discussion a little bit more. If food does provide an access to culture, it's a very specific kind, and a lot of times when communities, immigrant communities move into other countries and start their own restaurants and open their own stores, there's a question of integration, as there is with any kind of migration patterns, and food gets adopted, and then it mutates slightly to adjust to the new areas in which it's in. So, for instance, pizza that you get here, Chinese food is this catch-all phrase, tastes very different in all the different countries outside of Italy. And then, of course, within Italy or within China, there's large variations within those countries. So when we're talking about culture, how much are we actually talking about something that is quite native to the country in which it's coming from, and how much is that understood? And should there be more regulation on I don't know what this would look like, but in terms of how culture is spread and then how it takes hold within different communities and then starts to develop and mutate. Do we reach the point where there's no longer something very distinct coming from these different countries?
Actually, one of the most prominent dishes that has went through this kind of mutation, which was brought by a strong immigrant community, was actually the Derna Kebab in Germany, which people say is practically invented in Germany in the form that we eat it. It has very little to do with the shish kebab, which is the original form, which is just meat on a stick over a fire. We have a whole piece of bread with loaf of bread with meat in it, with vegetables, and that's very, very actually not very Turkish at all. It's German, and and that's why I said it's a very superficial access to culture, but it is an easy way. And coming back to Amy's point, I think both sides are true. A lot of people who have access to the foreign foods, they think they don't need to go to the foreign country anymore to experience the Japanese way. But a lot of other people, like myself, that would make me go to the foreign place to see more, to taste more, to experience more. So it actually it does not give the people. It gives a few people a little access, but a few people who are really interested, they get an incentive, which I think is a very strong promoter.
Okay, so your hand up, go.
Yeah, referring back to Amy's point again, I don't think it needs to be seen as an alternative to going somewhere. A lot of people don't have access to flying to Japan. So in that way, it can be seen as an alternative way for them to see it. Similarly, a lot of people don't have the skills to read literature in Japanese. So, there's these people who don't have the privileges to travel, to read, to access art necessarily, and in that form, it's a good way for them to access culture. And it doesn't mean it's not a comprehensive form of culture for them, but it is a form nonetheless.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I saw Dale's hand go up.
Yeah, I think a few people are missing the point here, in that, food's a good talking point just to get cultures, get people to understand each other's cultures and maybe develop that idea further. But I think as a method of cultural diplomacy, I'm not entirely convinced that it's a key tool to understanding each other's cultures. I think it's just insofar as it's a talking point that people can develop a friendship or can start understanding further ideas based on that. What we saw last week with the Indonesian ambassador, I think that got everyone talking, and that maybe got a few people talking to the delegation that came. But other than that, I don't think it really does that much. I'm not convinced.
Hi, I'd just like to back up Dale's point and just say that I think he's right, and it is a good tool, but it's something that comes to it at a side with something else and isn't necessarily strong enough on its own, because it is a good talking point, and it's good to ask the people that are from there, is this the right food? Like, how close is it to the food near there? But you do need that extra to know how close it is and whether it is right, what's different, and that's what you need.
Yeah, I also agree with this point that cultural diplomacy, it's a very little what it can do, but I think it's a very good way to facilitate cultural diplomacy and soft power, because food always makes very attractive every kinds of cultural event. But besides that, there was another thing that I was thinking about, that within culture, food can be very easily become stereotype, because when we cook our national food, we always cook the most obvious things. And that's why I think, for example, when we say, okay, now going to cook Italian, I will obviously cook pasta or pizza. Or if I say I'm going to cook Hungarian, it will be probably goulash. So it's hard to keep it away from stereotypes. Federico, I know you're from Italy. Do you agree that the Italians are just known for their pasta?
I completely agree with Nora, because I'm Italian and I'm in Germany, but I'm not among those kind of people that goes abroad and try just to look at their own nation restaurants. I've never been in an Italian restaurant in Berlin, and maybe I won't go there, because I know that first of all, I want to try other cultures. So I'm in Germany, I want to try what Germany has for traditional or similar, but I'm Italian, but I don't just eat pasta or pizza, because Italy, of course, is not just pasta, pizza, mandolino, and mafia, as most many people can imagine about it.
Okay, Phil, again.
Well, naturally, if I ate all the German signature pork dishes and potatoes all the time, I'd look quite different. But they are signature dishes, and as I said before, food is a catalyst for human interaction, and as I've experienced, you're always happy on a full stomach.
I think that food has a great potential, and for instance, I'd like to make an example, like in one city in Sweden, which is called Malmö. Food was used in a way to integrate immigrants into the Swedish society. One organization held an event where women from Turkish part of the city meet with with Swedish women, and they were cooking together Turkish and Swedish food, and thus they get to know each other, and some of them become friends, and actually some researches were made after it that gave the evidence that actually that event helped some people to meet native Swedish people, or else they wouldn't have a chance to meet.
Hannah?
I think it depends on how you define or where cultural diplomacy begins for someone. I mean, if it's on a very, very basic or very small level, I do think that food and meals are a very good tool for cultural diplomacy. And actually, when I was abroad on my Erasmus semester in Turkey, through eating and actually being invited to other families, I got to know so much about the culture and about the history of the country. And I think, as Phil also said, like eating together is really a basic thing, and it has always been that way. And I do think that you can it can assist cultural diplomacy at least. Finished.
I do agree with my colleague. In my exchange year in Sweden, we had the International Day. And of course, I cook Romanian, because I'm from Romania. And then a friend of mine from Iran, Tehran, comes to me and wants to try something. And he asked me, is it pork here? And then immediately I remember there is actually a connection between food and culture. Of course, you cannot serve someone from the Muslim world pork. It's like showing disrespect for its culture. And about the Swedish culture, one of the first things I've tried, I went to IKEA to try the meatballs. And I will always remember the specific Swedish food and the fact that they put, for example, sugar in the bread. And on my first Swedish language class, I asked my teacher, why? And the explanation was actually a cultural one. So I think, indeed, there is a strong relation between food and culture. And food can be like a good, how can I say, way to represent your culture. Thank you. Mm.
I think that's a really good point. That links in really well to what I was going to say. Some people have argued that food necessarily can't just stand up on its own as a point of reference for culture. I would argue it's possibly the best example that we have. It's accessible to everybody at every level of society. It's immediately identifiable in nation branding, which is a strong arm of cultural diplomacy. And if it's something that you identify with, it's a discussion point. What more can you ask as a tool for cultural diplomacy? It may be very basic, but it's extremely effective and widespread.
I would maybe temper a little bit with what Amy said, because it seems like a lot of these comments where food has been seen as an effective tool of cultural diplomacy has required a lot of interaction, being invited into someone's home, being able to ask questions or having the impetus to ask questions. But getting back to just simply having restaurants spring up all over the place, whether that it's in fact a very limited form of cultural diplomacy or if it can even be called cultural diplomacy at all. You go into a Chinese restaurant, you can say, I want a number 7. You don't even have to try to figure out how to pronounce whatever it is. And Japanese food seems to only be sushi, which is the most prevalent of the kind of Japanese food that we have ready access to. And then also in terms of, we're in Berlin, which is a very international city and a city, but then you go to smaller towns where a lot of, there isn't as high of an immigrant community and there isn't as much access. So again, I would wonder how limited it is.
I just would like to answer what Phil said before. I was thinking that actually the mix of food traditions sometimes is one of the most interesting aspects. You were speaking about the kebab and Germany, for example. Not everyone know that the doner kebab was actually created here in Berlin and not in Turkey. So it's often interesting to link, for example, the food tradition coming from a certain country with the needs of the hosting country. So often the restaurants, for example, Chinese or Turkish or Japanese, are not really cooking their traditional food that they would cook in their country, but they are mixing with the needs of the country that are hosting them. So this is an interesting point, but sometimes it's true that you cannot really feel the culture of the country eating in the restaurant in Germany, for example, even if in Germany there are many good Italian restaurants as well. I want to say to Federica. But yeah, this is a stereotype. You cannot really catch the real culture that you could catch in that country. That of course not everybody has the possibility to travel to Japan to eat sushi or to Turkey to eat other kind of food. But it's an interesting point.
Okay, so far we've discussed food as a stereotype or a positive way. Does anyone think that food can have a negative impact on a country's image. I know that some of my friends don't like spicy food, so would never dream of going to India. And I know that there are, unspicy food in India, but that's their image of India now, spicy food. So does anyone think that there's a negative impact on a country? Charlotte?
I think I'm going to take this opportunity to mention McDonald's because we all know it, and I guess it's bad for Americans because everyone presumes that when they go to another country, they will head straight to McDonald's, Starbucks as well, and it is known to be everywhere. But actually, Starbucks isn't that everywhere. It's we researched it today, and it's lacking actually compared to McDonald's, even though it's it's not a local restaurant for sure. But people say that McDonald's has a negative name. It's supposed to be not very good food, and people think that that's all they eat in America, and I think that's bad. It's got negative, but it's not necessarily good that it is everywhere as well.
Thank you. And I will take this opportunity to mention that recently in my country, when I visited McDonald's, I've seen there the ads, and also they were selling the sandwiches which were called in some kind of Ukrainian style. So they included not only parts of American culture or whatever they had before, but also the parts of the culture of the country in which they were serving food. So somehow it also, for person coming to McDonald's and searching for food, for the usual kind of food, this person might find some also examples of the national food of the country which they were in. So they are in now. So that was the point, that through taking the stereotypical kind of food and adding some elements, it can make person also aware more about culture. So I'm for the culture which is food which assists cultural dialogue.
Okay, I'm going to go to Hannah first, and then to Phil.
What I also find really interesting about, for instance, restaurants like McDonald's is that they're so standardized that it has kind of nothing to do with cultural diplomacy anymore, or you could not say food as a cultural element, because I think if you would enter a McDonald's in Istanbul or in Berlin, you wouldn't know where you are, because it's anyway so standardized, and the food, I think you were saying that there are differences, but they are? Okay, I haven't really noticed the differences yet. Maybe I'm not often enough in McDonald's, but for me it was always, it's so the same that you don't really know in which country, even though you're eating food. It's just, I guess that's what every fast food chain, not only McDonald's, but that it somehow loses the space element of where you actually are.
What I want to say about McDonald's, yes, everybody hates it. Yes, everybody eats it. I don't know why. I do once in a while too. I guess just because once in a while I crave junk food. But also, McDonald's is a very weak trade-off for another very American style of cooking, which is very well embedded into a lot of Western societies, and that's the good old barbecue. Everybody loves a good barbecue, right? With corn, with barbecued corn, with barbecued fish, with barbecued steaks, with barbecued sausages, with a lot of beer, and also a lot of people go to these kind of parties. International people, young people, they all talk, they all converse, they all have a good time together, and they all get to know each other.
You've made me really hungry now, Phil. Does anyone else have anything to say? I can see two Finnish people, and I know nothing about the Finnish culture. So, seeing as we're talking about food, do you want to tell us a bit about what your national cuisine is and whether or not you think it's a valid representation?
Well, actually, what I was thinking about before is that food really reflects the values of the culture as well. For example, about Finnish food is that it's quite practical. Like, we have bread that can keep good for about a month because it's dried, and we drink sour milk and do stews and stuff. But otherwise, like you said, you don't know anything about Finnish food, so it's not a very strong point of our culture, probably.
And because Finland is a very distant country in the, I would say, quite isolated, so we didn't have the access to spices. So our food is basically just salt flavored and maybe pepper, but it's quite bland because we didn't have the access to the spices.
Okay, thank you, girls. Okay, so I see an Irish person, and as an English person, the main stereotype about Ireland is potatoes. So what's your opinion on this?
I always find that quite strange because anytime I go to any other country, they manage to cook potatoes better than us, which is so weird. Even here in Germany, like I haven't tried it yet, but I hear there's so many different ways of cooking it. And in Turkey as well, they do famous kind of baked turkey potatoes. But in Ireland, I think we just boil them really. We're a bit like Finland in that we didn't have access. Our food is a lot of the time quite bland traditionally.
I think Phil took offence to the even there.
Well, I did take offense to the even because Germany is very, very strong, traditionally bound to potatoes since the 17th century, which I must add is pretty much the case everywhere in Europe because, I mean, they are from a foreign continent. And traditional foods often reflect the natural habitat and where a culture was formed. Like, you know, all the hot spices, they are from tropical regions because capsaicin is an antifungal agent, so to preserve the pepper shoots. So naturally, they use them a lot because they're nutritious, they're healthy, and well, they are also hot. So you have to get used to it.
Okay, I think Amy had something to say.
I just wanted to point out that this discussion we're having right now kind of proved my point from what I was saying a little bit earlier, that we're now talking about different kinds of food from different countries and why they taste the way they do. And it's like a key to the history of the country, as it were. I mean, it might be exaggerating slightly, but we're now talking about Finland, like the type of food that you have in Finland is because of, you know, your isolation, as you put it. And so I don't think we should downplay the role of food. And if we start talking about it as well, it then creates an even more interesting debate.
I actually have a microphone. Completely forgot I was holding it. I love going after Amy. She always makes me think of things. And this is actually to get back to an earlier point where I was also thinking that food really seems to be tied to the history of a country because before many countries were certainly a lot more isolated than we are now and living in this globalized community where different types of food can move back and forth as well as different people move back and forth and bring their cultural traditions with them. And then this idea of once you're established in a place, mixing with the cultures that are there and whether or not the historical food that comes from these different places will start to mutate, will start to change, and is there any concern at all that the food from our different countries will start to disappear, but maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, that coming out of all of this mixing of different types of food comes new food and new types of traditions. But is there any concern at all that we'll start to lose what makes German food German, or different types of Finnish food Finnish, or what comes from our different countries is being distinct from them? Is that a downside or actually a positive thing?
Sorry, just to put an example onto Sarah's, two of my housemates here in Germany, one is a German Swiss and one is French, and they constantly have the argument over which country is the nation of cheese. And but the worst thing is that they also have the argument over which country is the nation of certain dishes. For example, fondue. The Swiss insist that fondue came from Switzerland, and the French insist that it comes from there. And there's no way of knowing because the countries are so close, the borders are like in the mountains. It's absolutely no way of knowing. So the argument goes on forever.
Okay, right at the back.
I'm, for example, Turkish, and I have a friend from Greece. And when we talk about food, we actually come very easily to the conclusion that we have the same food, and then we start talking about the similarities between our cultures. And as maybe you know, they are not really very neighbors coming very well with each other in the history. But when we look to the culture and find similarities in food, we also find other points which are so similar, which bind each other. And so actually food in this sense brings people together.
Does anyone have an answer to that, or a response, or a new point? Bren, you haven't spoken.
To follow on from what's been said by a lot of people, I just sort of thought I'd quickly share with you a tale of my first couple of years at university. Until a few years ago, I'd never really heard of Armenia. I thought it was just a place confined to textbooks from medieval history. I know, small-minded. But I lived with a couple of Armenian guys for the first 2 years of university, and they were obviously very nervous. They'd never been to England before. And over the course of those 2 years, we'd sit down and they'd cook their national foods, things like shashlik, and eventually we moved on to dolma. And we'd sit down and we'd sort of discuss England and Armenia and the similarities and differences. And eventually we came to the conclusion that aside from obviously the massive geographical differences, we're effectively the same people. And it was just a really good experience.
Okay, thank you, Bryn. Does anyone have any similar experiences of cultural diplomacy through food? Hannah?
I wasn't really going for an experience, but I was thinking about also how important food is in terms of making up your sort of not only national heritage but national identity, and how closely you associate your own home foods because of how you've been brought up with those things to yourself, and how that makes you and how that reflects outwardly. And I think for me it's really positive in a sort of multicultural aspect to to be able to live in a city where I could go out pretty much every night for a month and eat a different dish, I think, from a different nation. And I think for me that's a really strong sort of way to represent national culture and and bring that together. I think it's really positive as opposed to a negative aspect of amalgamation.
Actually, yeah, going on from that, there's an English cook quite famous called Gordon Ramsay. I don't know if you've heard of him. But he does loads and loads and loads of programs where he goes traveling around the whole country. He went to Malaysia, he's been to Singapore, etc. And he explores their national dishes, and he actually enters a cooking competition where he has to cook the cuisine against, and Malaysia is the mamas of Malaysia, who are the best cooks in Malaysia. And, it's a TV program dedicated to the food, but you get an access into everyone's culture. So, that's a perfect example of, nation branding, representing themselves, and also food as cultural, as an access to cultural diplomacy. So I'm not sure I would have watched a program on Malaysia if it didn't include food or Gordon Ramsay. So, Natalia.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on previous speaker, also Hannah. So that you say that it is it is. I also agree that it is a good chance, to get to know different cultures, to live in a city where you have access to all these different restaurants or a lot of people, and who you can visit. But isn't it losing? Aren't you going to lose probably your identity when, for lunch you eat Italian food, for dinner you eat Japanese food, and when do you eat food from your own country? It's also, I don't say that I want to sound conservative about this, but somehow I think that some people some people tend to be so addicted to the to the culture of other countries, so that they become, for example, more Japanese than, for example, British, because they all love, I don't know, all the kind of manga and food and stuff. So that's.
Okay, Janelle, do you have something to say?
When it comes on to, back to the point about national identity, when it comes on to Jamaica, I'm very patriotic, and I am always going on about Jamaica. And last week, was it, in our team, we saw where they had on National Geographic, their website, they put the top 10 national dishes in the world. And of course, there up there you had like number 1, you had America with hamburgers. And then number 2 was Jamaica with ackee and saltfish. And I'm like, woo, way to go, because we're just like 2.8 million people. And it just, for me, it was just a very good moment, just of national pride just bursting out right there. Because, I mean, of all the countries in the world, of all the national dishes in the world, Jamaica was just number 2, which was good. But just to link back to your point about losing national identity, I don't want to say I disagree, but I really have a problem accepting, because when I left Jamaica and I went to Japan for a couple of years, and we do things very spicy. We always grill and we cook our meat for a very long time. I went to Japan and I was in the countryside, so I was just thrown out in the sticks to just immerse myself in the culture, which I had to do. And of course, most of the meat that was given to me was raw. So I had like raw horse meat. I had raw fish, which, you know, in our culture, it's a taboo. You don't eat raw meat. You just don't. And like after years, I had to learn how to just accept, you know, just eating that and being comfortable with eating that. And after, when I was leaving Japan, I was like, you know, I'm gonna miss this, I'm gonna miss that. And I found myself packing up things from the grocery store. I was buying seaweed, I was buying soy sauce, I was buying all these things. And my mom said to me, so you don't want me to ship a box of, because I was going to Sweden, you don't want me to ship a box of your favorite stuff, like your cornmeal porridge and stuff like that, to Sweden? And I'm like, no, I'm good, I have all the stuff I need. And I'm like, okay, then. But at the same time, I still like my Jamaican food, but just by going around and traveling and being exposed to different culture through food, you get to appreciate different elements of people's culture, even things that you would think were taboo, just by, you know, trying different things and appreciating culture. Yeah.
I think I very much agree with Janelle, and in response to your point, I think for me, I feel very, I mean, England doesn't have necessarily loads and loads of, you know, sort of national dishes out there or whatever, because we've sort of amalgamated a lot of, for me, okay, we have some wonderful dishes. However, like, the food I eat at home tends to be, you know, I cook pasta, I cook, like, for the things that aren't necessarily typically English as well, but nevertheless, I still feel that, you know, very proud of the culture that we have, and I enjoy sharing that with other people, and, you know, I staunchly, you know, drink my tea black with milk, and, you know, all this sort of thing, which is very typically British, and I think, yeah, I disagree.
Okay, Nora, and then Charlotte. Yeah, okay, so I also agree with the point that this access to lots of different kinds of national food makes us forget a little bit about our national dishes, but also the flow of culture, a globalized world, traveling, doing exchange in another country, or work in an international environment makes us also think more about our country and our national dishes, because people frequently ask me, like, what's your national dish? And then I have to start thinking about it. Or I'm invited for international potlucks, dinners, and then I have to bring something from my country. And then it makes me think about it, and also to eat my national dish. So it's true to a certain extent, but the opposite side is there as well.
Okay. So I just wanted to answer to Natalia a little bit, because sorry if I've completely missed your point, but when I go out, I want to experience other cultures, because the best British food is the food my mum cooks. And when I was in the Czech Republic and I asked the Czech students, oh, you know, where's the best Czech restaurant? And they said, oh, I don't know, because my mum cooks the best food. So that is where like food is an access to culture, because that's why you go out and eat it, because your own culture is right back at home, I guess. That's all I want to say.
And just to keep challenging this point, because I just find it really interesting, and I don't have an answer to it necessarily, but if it's, I wonder then, are we learning to cook our own foods? If it's our parents, definitely, I do not cook what my grandparents cook. In fact, if that food sort of kind of went by the wayside, I would be okay with that. And also getting back to the McDonald's thing, where the connection between national identity and food, that there's such a connection to beef in American identity, which I think could afford to be loosened somewhat, because it's also attributed to this kind of cowboy identity as well. The cowboys went out on the frontier and they, you know, reined in the steers and things like that. But now we're a very large population. We have access to a lot of different kinds of food, and the beef industry is really having a lot of detrimental environmental effects. But I don't, since I don't cook the same food as my grandparents, I'm wondering if those traditions, just out of curiosity, are getting passed on, considering that all generations, you know, tend to grow and develop and change from the generation that came before it, and if you know, some just something to think about, if some of these traditions will effectively die with our grandparents and then through our parents' generation.
We've crossed loads of points. We've discussed food as a positive access to culture, as a negative access to culture, as being quite superficial, as being in depth, as being an access to people's homes. You know, food can be used in such a variety of ways, both negative and positive. So I think it was a really good discussion, and thank you all for your participation. We do have food and drink downstairs on the topic. And next week we will be talking about the collapse of capitalism, so I'm sure that will be a lively discussion. We have a Facebook page and a Twitter page if anyone is keen to you know, carry on this discussion at a later date. Yeah, if you make your way downstairs, then there will be food and drink. So thank you for your time, everyone.